Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And for at least one season, the answer is certainly yes, as our A's have had a remarkable run here in the 2029 season to win the World Series championship, feeling some measure of small vindication as the first 5 years with this team were quite challenging, and we weren't necessarily seeing a lot of progress on the field, but I did feel like with some of the turnover that we were making with players and some of the younger players who we had admittedly inherited or traded for and not developed, we were making some good choices with who to keep around and who eventually developed into useful players. And we'll be talking about a lot of those players on our major league team shortly, but was quite honestly an epic playoff run for these Oakland A's. Going to have a lot of decisions to make in the coming weeks as we head into salary arbitration, but just recapping the run to the title. After a 94-win season, our first playoff appearance, and winning the AL West, took out a 93-win Kansas City Royals team with a 3-game sweep in the NLDS. Then we had an absolutely epic World Series against a 91, or League Championship Series against a 91-win Chicago White Sox team. They jumped out to a 3-1 lead for us in the series. We won the final 3 games to take the 7-game series 4-3. All 3 of those final 3 games were one-run games that we won, and the last 2 were walk-offs at home thanks to LCS MVP Chase DeLauder. And then we went and faced a 94-win Los Angeles Dodgers team in the World Series. The Dodgers had the highest budget and the highest payroll in baseball. Our A's had the lowest budget and the lowest payroll in baseball. And we took 4 out of 6 to capture that World Series championship. So, as I said, we've still got some big decisions to make this offseason. I am pretty frustrated, honestly, after the season that we put together, winning a World Series championship when all ownership expected or hoped for was that we were above 500 and delivering a profit of $27 million, that we actually had our budget cut back for this upcoming season to $124 million. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You can see our expenses this past season were a bit higher than normal, but thanks to the long playoff run, our revenues were way above, given the fact that we have been flat at $126 million for the last 4 seasons, when we have, for the most part, been delivering very small profitability in 1 year with a loss. Does seem a bit irrational to me that we got cut back, particularly with our attendance also going up about 40% to 2.15 million from 1.55 million the year before. As I think about this team going forward, we did get a 7-point bump in fan interest to 49, so that will help a bit, hopefully, with attendance next season. Perhaps we can supplement that this offseason, although because our budget has not been improved, we're not going to have a ton of money to spend or play with. Market size still tiny, and we still have minimal fan loyalty. A few years ago, we moved from pathetic down to minimal, and we have not been able to make any strides coming back there. You can see it looks like we have money available right now, but honestly, our scouting, development, and draft budgets are at much lower levels than I would like them to be. So we actually have a lot of work to do this offseason. Had 2 option decisions. We have declined Mitch Spence's option already, and Chase Lee, who was our closer this past season, he's actually been our closer for the last 2.5+ years. have a option for him at $2 million that we will likely exercise in the coming days. Recapping our team statistics for the year, was a fantastic season. The 94 wins were actually a couple less than expected. Never had a losing record in any month. The month of April, we were only 500, and we were only a game above 500 in March and May. But after that, the team was pretty strong. 10 games above 500 in June, 4 above in July, 7 above in August, and 3 above in September. And then clearly in October, we played our best baseball of the year. Overall, we ended up second in runs scored, made some huge improvements in our offense with some signings and trades last offseason. You can see first, second, or third in the vast majority of batting statistics for the year. 10th in homers, 9th in walks, 9th in steals. But otherwise, we are pretty close to the top of the pack in just about everything. And the pitching was outstanding. First in the American League in runs allowed. And you can see we were in the top 5 in every pitching category. And first in the majority of them. Also first in defensive efficiency and first in zone rating. So second in scoring, first in pitching, and first in defense is a good formula to win a division, which we did, and also a good formula to win it all, which we did end up doing here in 2029. So as we get ready for the offseason, time to do our annual review of our roster, see how everybody actually performed for us this season, and start formulating a plan for what we might want to do this offseason. And as we start thinking about the offseason at a very high level, you can see we were actually under 500 against left-handed starting pitching a year ago. So a big right-handed bat that can play in the outfield might be something important for us to think about. And pitching-wise, probably going to be looking for a left-handed starter and a left-handed reliever in a perfect world, as we're going to be moving on in all probability from some of the lefties on our staff this past year. Taking a look at our pitching staff, all of our starters won in double digits, and they really were all out there every day. No health issues of note this year among our starting rotation. Jackson Ferris, the 25-year-old who we traded for last offseason, plugged right in to our rotation. The top of it is our ace, 12-6 record with a 3.84 ERA, 3.2 WAR on the year. He ended up getting hurt in Game 2 of the World Series, so the Game 6 clincher, which would have been when he was on the mound, he did not get to pitch, but was still a big part of what we did, not just in the regular season, but also in the postseason. Arbitration number, about $2.8 million. We'll happily pay that, but he's going to start getting pretty expensive pretty quickly after that. Mason Miller, who's been with us since the start of this, had his best year as a starter for us. 14-8 record with a 3.17 ERA, 9.7 strikeouts per 9 innings, and a 3.3 WAR on the year. He will be back with us next year, and that somewhat front-loaded contract that we signed him to will be getting a bit more palatable for us in these next few years. We're hoping that our payroll would also be expanding, which probably isn't going to happen. So it's going to be a little harder to fit everyone in, but we'll do what we can, assuming that we don't decide to resign and go look for greener pastures because of disappointment in how Mr. Fisher is treating us and this team after a fantastic season on the field and a pretty darn good season, quite honestly, in the books as well. Bubba Chandler, a 13-6 record with a 3.02 ERA, best ERA on the team among qualifiers, and he led the AL in BABIP and WHIP, 3.2 WAR, so a lot of good, solid pitchers. Those three, Ferris, Miller, and Chandler, will likely be back to top the rotation next year, but the next two guys are guys that we could be losing. Nick Lodolo came on board this year, 10-9 with a 4.41 ERA. Like the left-hander, and he's been incredibly consistent over the past 3 years in terms of his Sierras. Another starting pitcher who gave us a 3 WAR on the season. Unfortunately, he's looking for 5 years at $17 million a year. We do have the opportunity to offer him a qualifying offer, but as we've talked about in comments to previous episodes, felt like he was going to need to have a monster year to not accept that qualifying offer, and given that the money that he's looking for, I think he probably would. So we're probably just going to let him hit free agency and get nothing for him. He wasn't incredibly expensive when we picked him up in a trade last offseason. So, and we won a World Series championship, so he contributed to that. Kyle Bradish ended up being the winner of Game 6 of the World Series, the World Series championship clinching game for us. But he had a rougher year this year than a year ago, although he improved from 10 wins to 12 wins. His ERA almost doubled from a league-best 2.66 to 5.08. That being said, his WAR was almost as good as it was a year ago. And as we've seen, all 5 of our starting pitchers had WARs between 3 in the 3.5 area. So very sound and strong performance. No real weak links among the rotation. And that was a big factor in what this team was able to achieve this year, both in the regular season and, most importantly, in the postseason. Turning to our bullpen, talked about Chase Lee, who will likely bringing back to compete for the closer job again. 1.97 ERA over 45 2/3 innings. Had 27 saves for us. That number was down significantly from a year ago, even though he arguably pitched much better this season. And the reason why his opportunities were less were that Mason Black, who we traded for this past offseason, had a monster year for us as a stopper, pitched in a AL leading 88 games, tied for the team lead with 14 wins, also had 17 saves and 10 holds, 3.68 ERA with 140 strikeouts over 137 innings pitched, put up a 1.5 WAR for us. He could be in the mix to join our rotation next year, since we'll be looking to replace both Lodolo and Bradish. But if we're able to find some other options for the rotation, real interested in seeing what Mason Black can perhaps do in the stopper role next year as well. Ben Leeper, former Rule 5 pick, had probably his weakest season with us. 4.11 ERA is the highest that we've gotten from him. The BABIP was actually only 255, and he only let batters hit a $1.99 against him. So maybe it really wasn't the worst season. His WAR of half a win above replacement suggests it was a middle-of-the-pack season for him. He did fine. He's a pretty generic right-handed arm out of the bullpen. Is going to be making more than the minimum next year, but still think the guy who throws in the high 90s could certainly be in the mix for us next year. Emmett Sheehan is a guy that we claimed on waivers from the Dodgers at the beginning of the 2028 season. With that well above average stuff and acceptable movement and control and a really nice 3-pitch arsenal, we've had relatively high expectations for him, and quite honestly, I can't say he's really met them. He did improve his ERA by almost a 1.5 this year, and his Sierra by almost a run, but he was still below replacement level when all was said and done. Think he's in the mix to come back next year, but the $2.5 million-ish or so that he's going to be making is getting a little expensive. He is a guy who could be in the mix to be in the rotation next year, so because of that, we could very well keep him around. Another guy who could be in the mix for the rotation is Mitch Keller. Traded for him in June, and we've already signed him to a relatively cheap extension. Put up a 3.47 ERA in 46 2/3 innings for us. A guy who can start or relieve for us, so definitely some value in Mr. Keller. Patrick Sandoval had a nice year for us as a lefty reliever out of the pen. 90 strikeouts, 3.35 ERA. We picked him up as a minor league free agent signing in March, and he ended up being a real good performer for us. Unlikely to be back, though, because he's looking for $8 million a year over 2 years. As much as we liked him and as much as we need a lefty, with the fact that we expect Lodolo to be gone and Sandoval and Tanner Scott both will likely be gone, I can't see us spending $8 million a year on him. Brian Wu, 1-0 record, 2 holds, basically was a long reliever for us most of the year, put up a 3.89 ERA over 81 innings pitched, was very respectable for us, another guy who could start in a pinch. He's looking for less money, only $1.6 million a year over 3 years, so it's not inconceivable that we bring him back next year to be in the bullpen and a potential back of the rotation starter, particularly if we had some injuries. Tanner Scott, we made a trade with him with Tampa Bay right before the trade deadline. Honestly, that was the biggest move that we made, and it didn't really pay off. He was 0-2 with a 5.11 ERA over just 12 1/3 innings pitched with Oakland. He wasn't particularly impressive for us, and as he heads into the offseason, he's looking for $14.5 million a year. So Scotty Scott will certainly not be back. Eric Silva will probably be moving on from. He's out of options at this point. Was not particularly impressive in either Las Vegas or 11 innings pitched with Oakland this year. Jesus Soto basically spent the entire year on the IL. He didn't basically spend the entire year on the IL. He did spend the entire year on the IL. Torn flexor tendon in his elbow. Recovery time is 2 months. He's headed to arbitration, set to make $1.9 million. If we knew he was going to be what he's been in the past, I think we'd happily bring him back, given the dearth of left-handers we have in our rotation right now. But he's coming off of a major injury. Obviously, since he hasn't pitched, our scouting accuracy on him has dipped too low. And I don't know if we're willing to invest that much in him going forward. So as you can see, as I noted before we even got into the pitchers, bringing on some left-handed arms is probably going to be a priority for us this offseason. Last, but hopefully not least, Duncan Marston. He was our first-round pick. Got him 4th overall in 2024. It's been a long slog through the minor leagues for Mr. Marston, but finally started to break out a bit this year. 5-4 with a 4.29 ERA in AA, 0-1 but a 3.72 ERA in AAA, and then we brought him up in September, and over 8 2/3 innings, he had a 2.08 ERA. Importantly, over the course of his minor league career, walks and home runs have been the big issue for Marston. You can see his control is below average, and he's a fly ball pitcher who's average at keeping the ball in the park. But he did not give up any homers, and he did not walk any batters in those 8 2/3 innings that he pitched with us. He will likely be in the mix to be a starter for us next year at the back of the rotation. And if he doesn't end up being a starter for us, certainly would expect that Mr. Marston will be part of the bullpen. So looking forward to seeing what he can do for us. He will probably also end up in the development lab this year. Going to look at all of the options, obviously, before we move forward a day. My initial thought is we have him work on one of his off pitches, which hopefully will result in one of those pitches getting better, where there's lots of potential for that to happen, and maybe his stuff taking a step forward as well. Turning to our position players, Drake Baldwin is our catcher against right-handed pitching. The last 3 years, the offense has not been great, even though we're kind of playing him as a left-handed batter where we think he should be most effective. Only an 86 WRC plus this year, hit just 220. Love his glove, but the 1.5 WAR is the lowest of any full season that he's had with us at this point. Only 28 years old. He will turn 29 before the next season begins. Hope that we'll get a little bit more from him offensively. Looking at his ratings, we think he should be pretty productive playing primarily against right-handed pitching, but haven't seen that recently. Still like our catching situation, though. We traded for Agustin Ramirez last offseason, the right-handed hitter, to start for us against left-handed pitching. He's more than competent defensively and playing primarily against lefties. He gave us a nice offensive season, 14 doubles in 227 at-bats, put up a 121 WRC plus for us, and a 2.1 WAR for us, which was actually higher than that the erstwhile starter Drake Baldwin put up. Charlie Condon, a 26-year-old that we traded for with Cleveland last offseason, quite honestly was a little disappointing, but we were expecting him to be somewhere between the great season he had with Cleveland in 27 and the awful season he had with Cleveland in 28. So we kind of got that from him, but a 91 WRC plus for a guy who is a pure bat. He's not really good anywhere defensively. He's fragile in terms of his injury proneness. Set to make $3.4 million next year. He could be a guy that we move on from for financial reasons, particularly if anyone ascribes some significant trade value to him. Part of the reason for the much better offense we had this year was the addition of guys like Ramirez and Condon and some others we'll talk about in the previous offseason. But the biggest reason was 2 career years from our 2 best offensive players. And one of them was Tyler Soderstrom. Led the AL with a .323 batting average, also led the league in slugging, OPS, and WRC plus at 166. Only started 110 games. We were able to put him in a situation where he was starting only against righties this year, and that really let his percentage kind of numbers improve considerably when he didn't have to be facing lefties. 35 homers, 112 ribbies, and a 4.9 WAR. One of 2 massive career seasons that we wouldn't expect to repeat next year, so probably going to be some regression from that perspective. But signing Soderstrom in the very early stages of this playthrough when he was pretty unproven to a long contract that he has more than lived up to has been a key factor in building this A's franchise, and given the limited amount of funding we're expecting going forward, still going to be a pretty important asset for us next year and beyond. We reunited with Eddys Leonard right before the trade deadline. He hit a .182 in 44 at-bats for us, playing primarily against left-handed pitching. Was even worse in the postseason, was 2 for 16 playing primarily against lefties, although he did have 1 big home run for us. He's set to make about $2.4 million next year. Likely another guy we'll look to see if there's any trade value in. Max Muncy, utility infielder for us this year, hit just .215 in 275 at-bats. Like the personality, like the defensive versatility, he just has never really given us any reason to think he's going to be an average major league hitter. He was basically a replacement level player this past year. He is still set to make the major league minimum next year, although he's out of option years at this point. Should be in the mix to be a utility infielder for us again next year. Brian Rincon didn't have the type of monster year that we talked about with Soderstrom and that we're going to be talking about shortly with Mr. Keith. But he had a really nice bounce back year for us this year. Had 16 homers and 78 ribbies, stole 22 bases, had 30 doubles, all added up to a 111 WRC plus and a 4.9 WAR, helped by his excellent defense. Played over the course of the season a lot of second base for us, but he did start at shortstop for us on occasion as well. He is finally arbitration eligible, set to make 4.9 this upcoming season. We'll probably keep him at that number. Don't love that he's fragile, but I think he's the best middle infielder we have at this point, since he can actually hit from time to time. After this upcoming season, unless we get a big bump in our finances, which I can't say I'm expecting, maybe time for us to look to move on from him and see what trade value there is in him after the 2030 season, when he gets really expensive in his arbitration years. Colt Keith, we traded away Hidero Endo to pick him up almost a year ago, and Keith had an absolutely monster season for us. He only played in 133 games, as he had 2 stints on the IL, one for plantar fasciitis and one for a back injury after he was mugged. But when he was in the lineup, he was the straw that stirs the drink. 33 doubles, 38 homers, 128 ribbies, which was tied for second in the AL, hit almost 300, put up a 158 WRC plus and a team best 6.2 WAR for us. Looking forward to seeing what the third baseman can do next year. The Tigers did keep 35% of his contract, so next year we're only going to be on the hook for $6.5 million. But he will start getting progressively more expensive as he gets into his late 20s and early 30s. If he performs the way he did this past season, though, it will certainly be worth it. I mentioned that Brian Rincon played some short for us this year, but our primary shortstop was supposed to be Cameron Cawley. Unfortunately, he tore a PCL in early April. He was close to a league average offensive player before that, and given his really good glove and his good speed, he had put up almost 1 WAR in just 23 games. But he is fragile physically at this point, still recovering from that torn PCL, and he has never at this point played more than 75 games in a season. He's suffered pretty significant injuries each of his 3 full years in the majors. And until this past season, and the very small sample size of 82 at-bats, he had never indicated that he was going to be a competent major league offensive player. He's set to make $2.8 million-ish in arbitration. Probably bring him back next year, but it's hard to imagine that 2 years from now, both Rincon and Cawley will be on the team as their arbitration numbers keep getting higher. With Cawley being hurt, the fact that we signed Hideki Etakawa to a minor league deal with a major league option coming over from Japan this offseason really paid off well. The bat did slow a bit in the second half of the year. He just finished with an 83 WRC plus, but he did have 20 doubles and 10 home runs and a 2.3 WAR on the season. And with that 70 infield range, he played a more than competent defensive shortstop for us with a 13.5 zone rating, 1.082 defensive efficiency. He will be making $1 million next year, so he will certainly be back with us. And the hope is that between the fragile, possibly wrecked Cawley by the time he gets back, the fragile Rincon, and then the normal injury proneness Arakawa, we can handle second base and shortstop pretty competently next year with those 3 players. Moving to our outfielders, Brian Buelvis has been on the team for the past few years. His captain personality has been a big reason why he's actually made the roster. Fragile physically, a right-handed hitter who's better against left-handed pitching, and that's where he typically plays. Put up a 108 WRC plus for us and a 1.5 WAR over just 246 at-bats. So he wasn't great offensively, but he was more than competent. The 8 triples in 246 at-bats certainly helped. He was also 12 of 13 on the base paths. He is now at the point where he's arbitration eligible, so he's going to likely be making a little over $2 million next year. If we move on from him, we're going to have to figure out another captain personality. I always like to have one of them at least on my teams, and with the fact that we've already declined the option on Mitch Spence, who was our other potential captain if he was in the starting rotation, Buelvas could be back next year by virtue of the captain personality and by virtue of the fact that he is pretty good against left-handed pitching, which is a weakness of ours already. Don't know if we want to move on from him and make it even weaker. Byron Buxton, brought him on board as a free agent signing in January. Put up a 94 WRC plus for us. The batting average was only .222. But he did have 11 homers and 17 doubles in 288 at-bats. 1 WAR on the season. His outfield range is rapidly declining. He's not looking for crazy money. 3 years at about $3 million a year. I don't think we bring him back. He's also wrecked physically at this point, but it's not inconceivable that he ends up with us again next year. Chase DeLauder did have a pretty long stint on the IL over the summer, but still played in 120 games, 41 doubles in 466 at-bats, also had 10 homers, scored 73 runs, drove in 55, ended up hitting .281 with a 117 WRC+. We picked him up in a trade with Cleveland, the same one that brought Mr. Condon over. I believe Daryl Hernandez was the main guy that we had to give up in that trade. See how bad my memory is. Yeah, Daryl Hernandez and then Jordan Romano, who we had picked up in a deal where he was basically going to be free for us next year, so he had a good amount of value. And Romano actually had a really nice year out of the bullpen for Cleveland, .220 ERA over 61 1/3 innings. But we ended up getting younger by virtue of that trade, and we also won a World Series championship, and DeLauder was the ALCS and the World Series MVP, so things worked out well for us on that front. Luis Lara, fragile center fielder, still not even 25 years old, really good speed, excellent defensively. The issue with him has always been the bat. And this year, when he was healthy and in the lineup, the bat was actually pretty productive. A 106 WRC+, 2.9 WAR on the season, 23 doubles, 10 homers, 21 stolen bases. With that glove, if he can put up above average offensive play, he is a pretty valuable player. He's another guy that we signed when he was somewhat unproven and early, similar to Soderstrom. So we have him locked up through his 30s at pretty reasonable numbers. Again, if he's able to be a league average offensive player with that glove in center field and the ability to steal some bases, he's a pretty valuable player as long as he's actually healthy. Dalton Varsho won't be back. Split the year between AAA and the majors after we signed him as a minor leaguer. Was actually pretty productive with a 121 WRC+ and 75 major league at-bats. Not looking for crazy money, $1.8 million a year over 2 years, but he'll turn 34 next year. And given that we're looking for help against left-handed pitching, I think perhaps bringing on an outfielder to replace him who's a right-handed hitter is probably the direction we'll go. Lawrence Butler is a guy that we signed to a longer-term contract that hasn't necessarily worked out as well as the ones that we gave to Soderstrom and Lara, and unfortunately Butler's was also more expensive. On paper, looks like a useful player, decent defensive outfielder, decent batting ratings, and against right-handed pitching in particular, looks like he should be a pretty good player. but only an 80 WRC plus this year, 21 doubles, 16 homers. He did drive in 73 runs, but the steals fell to 7 this year from 22 a year ago, and he was only 0.4 wins above replacement, given the very mediocre offense. Probably the most disappointing offensive season of anyone on our team, because we have expectations that Butler should be productive offensively, and he really was not this year. But even with disappointing offensive years from the first guy we talked about, Drake Baldwin, and the last guy that we talked about, Lawrence Butler, this offense still added up to the second most runs in the American League, and when all was said and done, we were the last team standing in early November. So going to have to do some work this offseason, but I think adding a right-handed batter who can potentially play maybe a corner outfield spot is probably the most important thing for us to think about, particularly if we do end up moving on from Charlie Condon. The interesting thing about Condon is, although he's a right-handed hitter, he's actually more productive against right-handed pitching, so that's not exactly what we need at this point, given our struggles against left-handed pitching last season. So we'll see what we end up doing. It's conceivable we could look to trade away Butler. I don't know how much trade value there really is there. Eddie Leonard, if someone wants to trade for him, we'd happily do that. Charlie Condon, as we talked about, might be a guy to move on from as well. And with that, we will call it an episode. Thank you, as always, for watching. Thank those of you who have had kind things to say about the fact that we were able to finally put things together and win the World Series this year. Do feel that we're finally making some progress with this team after feeling like we were banging our head against a wall for the first 5 seasons of this playthrough. So looking forward to some interesting decisions this offseason. We will take a look at the top prospects across our organization and what they did last year, as well as some of the top prospects in all of baseball in our next episode. And then will likely be time to make a decision as to whether we're going to come back with Oakland or whether we are going to tell Mr. Fisher exactly what he can do with his $124 million budget for the defending World Series champions. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.